Greetings, welcome back to our Ancient Persia video lectures. Today we're going to look at the aftermath of the Persian invasion of Greece and focus on the reign of Xerxes' son, King Artaxerxes I, and his foreign relations with the Greek city-state of Athens. Athens had played a critical role in Greek resistance to the Persian invasion of mainland Greece. In the aftermath of that invasion, it emerged as the head of a Greek alliance called the Delian League. It took the Ionian Greek cities of coastal Anatolia out of Persian control and collected tribute from them while fighting continuous naval wars against the Persians on Persia's northwestern front. Eventually, around 450 or 449 BCE, though King Artaxerxes I of Persia and Athens and the Delian League seem to have stopped military operations against one another. And the question is, why and under what circumstances did this peace occur between the Persians and their Greek opponents? Artaxerxes I has one of the longest reigns of any Persian king. He succeeds Xerxes on his assassination in 465 BCE, and he rules for almost 42 years. Unfortunately, this is one of the most difficult periods in Persian imperial history in terms of sources. Because Herodotus's narrative history ends with the year 479, and later Greek histories, such as Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, or Diodorus's Universal History, spend much less time on Persian-Greek relations than Herodotus had. As a result, we don't have nearly the amount of narrative detail that we did surrounding the Persian invasions of Greece. But in Artaxerxes' reign, we can trace a progression and an evolution in Persian-Greek relations. What we see is a gradual shift from an emphasis on Persian military invasions and campaigns to a more diplomatic approach that seems to have yielded greater results for the Persian Empire in the long term. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is the transition from Xerxes to Artaxerxes I. And then we'll think about some key events in Artaxerxes' relations both with Athens and with the Persian province of Egypt. Now, when Xerxes died in 465, again, we know that he is assassinated in the summer of 465. We have a very brief Babylonian chronicle record that says simply, the king's son killed him. Greek and Roman sources give us more elaborate stories of Xerxes' assassination in a court conspiracy, supposedly involving a number of eunuchs and other court figures. But the exact circumstances, motives, and background for the deed are really unclear. We know that not only Xerxes, but his crown prince, Darius, are both killed, and that ultimately Artaxerxes, who comes to power, is the youngest son of the former ruler. According to most of the Greco-Roman accounts, the eunuchs and other conspirators managed to assassinate Xerxes in his bedroom and then convince Artaxerxes that his older brother Darius had killed their father. Artaxerxes then kills the heir to the throne to try to avenge his father's death. The conspirators plan to murder Artaxerxes, but with the aid of a general, Megabyzus, Artaxerxes gets the drop on them and kills them first. Many modern scholars, just as in the case of the Bisitun inscription, have regarded this account with some suspicion. It comes from late outside sources. It's possible that it derives from some palace tradition going back to Artaxerxes himself, although we have no surviving inscriptions of any length from Artaxerxes' reign. However, modern historians have been suspicious of the narrative of Artaxerxes' innocence. And a more common modern assumption is that Artaxerxes may have masterminded a simple coup to eliminate his father and his older brother, and himself to take the throne. Artaxerxes' reign, as we've mentioned, is fairly poorly known. We have relatively few internal sources that shed light on the political events of the reign. All of them that we do have focus on the western portions of Artaxerxes' empire. Diodorus and Thucydides give us some details about Artaxerxes' relations with Athens and with Egypt. And then we have a sort of court romance, a book called the Persica by a Greek doctor, Ctesias, who lived at the Persian court around 400 BCE, and wrote what one scholar has called a quasi-historical romance dealing with Persian court intrigues. It lends some extra details, especially about supposed rebellions against the king by Megabyzus later in his reign. But Ctesias survives only in fragments, and many of the short summaries of his work that do survive are questionable in their details. So here are the major events that we're aware of, keeping in mind that there's much in the center and eastern parts of the empire that we don't know about, and that the story of Persian behavior in the west is fragmentary at best. We know that a few years into Artaxerxes' reign, probably based on Egyptian records, in the year 463, there's a successful rebellion against Persian authority in Egypt. And an Egyptian prince based in the Nile Delta, maybe of Libyan tribal background, whose name is Inaros, comes to power and declares himself pharaoh. The Persians responded to this with military force, but Inaros was able to kill the brother of Xerxes and satrap of Egypt, a man named Achaemenes, after the dynastic founder figure. And the rebels took control of most of the Nile Delta. The Persians, on the other hand, held on to the satrapal capital at Memphis and the White Castle, the key fortress there from which the Persians control Egypt. Now, Inaros, once he's taken power, appealed to foreign alliance to help Egypt stay independent from Persian rule. He appealed to Athens, which now had the Delian League, this naval alliance of Greek city-states in the Aegean Sea and Ionia. Athens was starting to quarrel with Sparta at the same time. In 459, Athens would begin the so-called First Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a prequel to the Greater Peloponnesian War that begins in 431. But the Athenians don't let their internal quarrels in Greece distract them from the opportunity for expansionism overseas. The Athenian democracy is boundlessly confident in its resources and its military power. And by 461 or 460, the Athenians have voted to send aid to the Athenian rebels, and an Athenian fleet sails down to Egypt to support Inaros. Now, Athens had a record of naval victories against the Persians, as well as retaking Persian bases in Ionia and Thrace. Around 466, a large Athenian fleet had defeated a Persian fleet and land force at Eurymedon on the southern coast of Anatolia. And the Athenians may win some skirmishes against Persian forces when they first land in Egypt. But King Artaxerxes orchestrated a large counterattack and sent a major Persian army, and possibly supporting naval forces, to re-invade and reconquer Egypt. By the year 459, Persian forces are fighting their way into the Nile Delta, and they manage to defeat Inaros. They trap Athenian forces in Egypt on an island called Prosopitis between canals in the Nile Delta, and besiege them there, according to Thucydides, for 18 months. At the end of this, the Persians use engineering techniques to drain the water in these canals and storm the island, and the entire Athenian force in Egypt is destroyed or forced to surrender. So this is a major Persian military victory. Egypt is reincorporated very quickly into the empire. Inaros is captured and executed by Persian forces, although a few rebel holdouts remain in corners of the delta, and a few years later, Inaros' son is given a land grant in the Nile Delta in exchange for loyalty to the Persian regime. We'd like to know more details. The accounts of this war in Thucydides and Diodorus are pretty bare bones, as you'll see in the readings. But an interesting feature is that Artaxerxes himself, although he's a new king, does not lead this campaign in person. We don't know why. He's probably somewhere in the center of the empire, but he relies entirely on delegation and presumably on the Persian messenger system to have his general Megabyzus fight the war for him. Megabyzus wins victories, and that is sufficient to keep up the imperial prestige. If Ctesias is to be believed, Megabyzus revolted later in Artaxerxes' reign, but was ultimately pardoned and brought back into the imperial fold. And it seems that Artaxerxes, without following the older tradition of campaigning on the frontier in person, is still able to maintain his image and the glory of the Achaemenid monarchy. We know from a few short inscriptions and archaeology that Artaxerxes continued and completed the building projects at the palace at Persepolis, and he seems to continue to associate himself with the successes of Xerxes and Darius, while ruling the empire with confidence in his own right. Now, a few years after the Persian victory in Egypt, there's one more Persian versus Athenian military encounter on the island of Cyprus in 450 BCE. An Athenian navy goes to Cyprus and tries to take the partially Greek cities of Cyprus away from Persian rule. The Athenians supposedly win a naval battle against a Persian fleet, but on land, they got bogged down in besieging Cypriot cities that don't surrender to the Athenians. And ultimately, the Athenians call off the invasion and go home. Their commander, the famous Athenian general Cimon, dies of disease during the operation. Shortly after the Cyprus expedition, the Persian general Megabyzus, acting on behalf of King Artaxerxes, is supposed to have sent an embassy to Athens asking the Athenians to negotiate a peace. And in return, the Athenians sent an ambassador named Callias, who traveled all the way to Susa, up the royal road with Persian permission, who negotiated with the king, and this resulted in a Persian-Athenian peace agreement, the Peace of Callias in 449 BCE. This is the story that's told by Diodorus of Sicily, who wrote this down in about 50 BC. He was probably using a now lost history by a Greek writer named Ephorus, who wrote in the later 300s BC, so more than a century after the event in question. The Peace of Callias is a crucial diplomatic event, but unfortunately it has been the subject of some of the greatest controversies in the history of Persian-Greek relations. It's only described by late sources, it's only described in detail by Diodorus, this very late source, and Thucydides, who writes the history of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, never mentions it at all. Now, Thucydides leaves out a lot of things. Thucydides writes a history of the Peloponnesian War that focuses on Spartan-Athenian conflict from 431 down to the sudden stop of Thucydides' book in 411 BC, a 20-year period. In Book 1, Thucydides gives a brief overview of the so-called Pentacontaedia, the 50-year gap between Xerxes' invasion of Greece and the outbreak of the Great War between Athens and Sparta. Thucydides' sketch of what happened in the half-century in the meantime is sketchy, it's brief. It focuses on key moments in the rise of Athenian power. Thucydides never mentions a peace between Persia and Athens. He also doesn't mention the assassination of Xerxes and various other historical events that don't touch directly on his thesis. We also have some brief fragments, that is, late quotations from a lost history of the 300s BC by a Greek author named Theopompus. Theopompus, in one of these fragments, claims that a peace between Athens and Persia is a forgery made up to flatter the Athenians. Unfortunately, we don't have a good sense of how to evaluate Theopompus. We don't have a longer context for the quote. Theopompus, from what we see in some other quotes, is capable of historical errors regarding Persia. He is also a late source. We don't know if we can take him seriously as evidence that there was never a peace agreement of any sort between the Persians and the Athenians. Many historians in the 20th century believed that Thucydides' silence, plus the quotes from Theopompus, meant that there was no peace, and that Diodorus' sources made it all up. More recent scholarship in the late 20th century and the early 21st century has been more willing to recognize the existence of some kind of peace agreement. Whether or not it was a formal written treaty, whether or not Diodorus' peace terms are exaggerated and make it seem like the Athenians came out better than they did, what is clear is that hostilities stopped between Athens and Persia in the second half of the 400s. It's also clear from a number of archaeological indicators that trade surged between Athens and Persian territories in the second half of the 400s. We suddenly get huge amounts of evidence for the presence of Athenian silver coins in Persian territories, in Egypt, in Phoenicia, in Cyprus and Cilicia. It seems that the Persians and Athenians stop fighting one another, and that there's an upsurge in economic exchange across the eastern Mediterranean, with Athens bringing silver and various other goods to parts of the eastern Mediterranean that are still under Persian rule. So the Peace of Callias, while still controversial, you'll notice that Waters in his textbook is still a little skeptical on its existence, but the peace at least stands for a break in hostilities that benefits both Athens and Persia. And for the rest of Artaxerxes' reign, we see no more major military encounters between the two. I've argued in my first book that this is a deliberate accommodation by Artaxerxes, that Artaxerxes sees that there's nothing to be gained from continuing warfare on the Greek frontier, and that essentially he makes a trade-off. He seems to have allowed Athens to continue taxing and controlling the Ionian Greek cities, which the Persians had once directly controlled. But I've argued that this may be envisioned from the Persian point of view as a land grant, comparable to what we know they did with Inaros' son, who was allowed to rule those territories in the Nile Delta in exchange for loyalty to Persia. Now, the Athenians don't have to swear allegiance to the Persian Empire. From the Persian point of view, Athens sending gifts, sending ambassadors, sending money to Persian provinces could be characterized as the Athenians being part of this world that King Artaxerxes, with the grace of Ahura Mazda, rules. The Persians don't attack the Ionian Greek cities and try to take them back from Athens, but in exchange, the Athenians don't attack Cyprus. They don't attack Egypt or other Persian possessions anymore. And I think what we see here is a pragmatic development in Persian diplomacy. Artaxerxes recognizes that the claim to world rule does not demand his own personal presence on the frontier any more than it demands the extension of Persian administrative control over every territory. Instead, he can keep up the claim to world rule while encouraging flexible arrangements on his western frontier. And it's clear that he profits from the peace or cessation of hostilities with Athens. The Athenian trade with Egypt and Phoenicia results in increased profits for Persian taxation on that frontier. We're well informed on this dynamic, partly from a document called the Elephantine Customs Record, which is a Persian tax register from Egypt. It illustrates not the direct trade between Persian subjects and Athens, but it illustrates the tax mechanism that would have given the Persians profit from this trade. Basically, it's a tax register that shows the Persians taking a 10% cut of major cargoes going in and out of a port in the Nile Delta. This shows that the Persian authorities collect directly from every single ship that comes in and out of Egypt. We think they may have done this with ports in Phoenicia, Cilicia, and other coastal regions as well. So if Athenian merchants trade with Egyptians, say they trade Athenian silver for Egyptian grain, which we know is a commodity moving from Egypt to Athens in this period, the Persians are going to take 10% of the cargo of every single ship involved in that trade. And that means that, however indirectly, King Artaxerxes of Persia is taxing Athens, is taxing Athenian silver and Athenian produce. Egypt and Phoenicia lack native sources of silver, and yet we see an influx of silver in both regions from Athenian coinage. The Athenians are minting more coins, they're flowing east, they're being reused, sometimes either turned into weighed metal or re-stamped and reissued by Phoenicians and Egyptians. One of the things that they're doing with silver in Egypt and Phoenicia is paying Persian taxes. So again, peace between Athens and Persia brings economic benefit to the Persians as well as the Athenians, who can benefit from this eastern trade. Finally, we see evidence for an increased slave trade between Persian-controlled Anatolia and the Levant and Athens. And again, we know that the Persian king taxes slave sales within the empire. Finally, I've argued that the Persian king can benefit economically from saving the costs that would have been necessary to supply Persian naval fleets for extended warfare. Trireme warships require replacement on average every 20 years. They're expensive, their crew's logistical support is expensive, and this is an expense the Persians no longer have to keep up if they avoid large-scale naval wars with Athens and instead focus on trade on their western frontier. So I've argued that Persian-Greek relations evolve, but in the long run, their evolution suggests that Persia can't be simply depicted as losing its Greek wars. Rather, it figures out how to bring the Greek campaigns to a compromise solution that benefits the empire as well as its Athenian trade partners. And I've argued that from Artaxerxes' point of view, the Persians most likely depicted Athens and the overseas Greeks as their subjects, as clients in the Persian sphere of influence at the edge of the world.